David Walker is an accountant. He's a CPA, and if I noticed on his lapel, he's got a little pin that says CPA, so it's an honor for me to be able to introduce him. He has a long history of service both in the private sector and the public sector, and he's now working for a nonprofit organization. One of his real accomplishments was in November of 1998, he was appointed by President Bill Clinton to become the Comptroller General of the United States, which is sometimes referred to as the Chief Auditor of the United States, and head of the Government Accountability Office. That was actually his third presidential appointment. He had also been appointed to previous positions by Reagan, Bush 1. So he had Reagan, Bush 1, and President Clinton, so quite a variety there. During his tenure there, he spoke out often about the problems with government deficits and the building debt that was occurring. He, I think, felt somewhat constrained by being in government, and so in 2008, March of 2008, he resigned to take a position with the newly formed Peter G. Peterson Foundation. And the Peterson Foundation is to promote federal financial responsibility today in order to create more opportunity tomorrow. One of the things that Mr. Walker has always focused on is the long-term view. He's also been a featured subject of a wonderful documentary, if you haven't seen it, IOUSA. He's featured in that. I also should mention, just in case he's too modest to do so, that he has a forthcoming book. On January 12th of next year, a book called Come Back America will be published. And the publisher describes it as a tough-minded, innovative, inspiring guide to help us avoid the approaching economic abyss and put the country back on track again. When he resigned from the GAO, he was quoted saying, "While I love both my job as Comptroller General and the GAO, I love my country more. And I believe that leading this foundation represents a unique opportunity and will be good for our country." Last Wednesday, when Bill Clinton spoke here, he mentioned that he hoped that this center and that the Clinton School would be forces for discussions about important issues. I can't think of a more important issue than the financial future of our country, and I can't think of a better speaker to address that than David Walker. Please join me in welcoming David Walker.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and very pleased to have such a great crowd because I'm competing with President Clinton, who's speaking not very far from here. So I was very concerned that I was going to have an empty room when I came here and found out about that this morning. And I am honored to have been a presidential appointee of President Clinton as well as Reagan and Bush 41. I don't know of anybody else, frankly, who's had those three, but if you know somebody, please tell me. I may be the only one. Let me, if I can, tell you a little bit about what you wouldn't get out of my bio. On my lapel, I have two pens. The top one is a rosette, which is the Sons of the American Revolution. I am president of the George Washington chapter of that organization. I live on land that George Washington used to own in Mount Vernon. And the one below is a certified public accountant pen, of which I am. So the combined effect of being a member of the Sons of the American Revolution and a CPA is I'm a patriot who can add. And I can tell you that we need a lot more of those in Washington, D.C. You know, you may or may not know that the United States is not top 25 in the world in math and science at the high school level. I don't think we're top 100 in Washington, quite frankly, and I think we're seeing that evidenced. I was fortunate to be able to take a tour. Bob helped me to take a tour of the library, and one of the greatest accomplishments, I think, of President Clinton, he had many, was he turned the country around from a fiscal standpoint. And one of the things I suggested is that they ought to change the exhibit to show what the fiscal results were from 1980 through 2008. And you would see that they weren't too great before 1992, and they definitely weren't great after 2000. And that would make that message even more powerful than otherwise it would be, because everything in the world is relative. So let me start off with a few key points. If you're not strong economically, nothing else matters. The largest threat facing the United States is not terrorism. It is not nuclear proliferation. It is not climate change, although those are all important. It is our own fiscal irresponsibility. We are pushing this country towards bankruptcy at an alarming rate. We face serious challenges that threaten our collective future. Many of these challenges we will not be able to solve unless we go beyond the normal legislative processes, special commissions, and maybe even constitutional conventions. We have to make sure that all of us are informed and involved, but young people in particular have a disproportionate responsibility and opportunity because their future is being mortgaged at record rates. Relative investments in their future are being cut back at a time where America faces increasing competition in the world. We must make some tough choices sooner rather than later if we want our future to be better than our past. We should do it sooner rather than later because they won't have to be as significant. We'll be able to transition in over a longer period of time. We'll be able to help people plan. And we will be able to have the most powerful force on earth work for us rather than against us. Albert Einstein, pretty bright person, reminded us that the most powerful force on earth is not nuclear energy. The most powerful force on earth is the power of compounding. And when you're an investor or you make tough choices sooner rather than later, the power of compounding can work for you. But when you're a debtor or you delay making known necessary choices, the power of compounding works against you. I'll make another provocative statement at the beginning. We have a dysfunctional democracy. We have a republic that is not representative of the public because of several things. How we redistrict in the House, campaign finance, and we have something that the Founding Fathers never intended. It's called career politicians, where they view their position as a job and they want to keep it for life, and therefore they don't want to state the facts, they don't want to tell the truth, they don't want to make tough choices because they want to keep their job. And the result of that is a live for today, mortgage tomorrow mentality, which threatens our future. We have three maladies in society, and they are particularly acute and have reached epidemic proportions in Washington. Myopia, or nearsightedness. Tunnel vision, looking at one issue at a time without understanding the bigger picture and the domino effect of when you make a change in one area, the effect that it has in others. And then self-centeredness. Too much focus on the word me, not enough focus on the word we. People still think there's a free lunch. There is no free lunch, not even the one I just had. Somebody's going to have to pay the bill. It's probably the library. Let's talk about what's happened to our federal budget in the last 40 years, because it's important not just to look at today, but to put it in context with the past, and I'm also going to show you where we're headed. And I think you'll get the message pretty clearly. In the last 40 years, the nature of the federal budget has changed dramatically. In 1969, it was dominated by defense. 45% of the federal budget was for defense. Only 4% was for Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid, of course, were passed in 1965. Last year, 19% for defense, 19% for Medicare and Medicaid, and 19% for Social Security. That trend can't continue. Last year, only 6% of the federal budget was for interest on the debt, but guess what? We're adding debt at record rates, and interest rates are at historical lows. Interest rates will go up when the economy turns around and we pass the immediate crisis. The only question is, how much, how fast? The combined effect of more debt and higher interest rates means that more and more the federal budget will be paying for sins of the past, excess consumption, and less to create a better future. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, the agency that I headed for 9.5 years until 2008, recently projected that even without an increase in interest rates, the single largest line item in the federal budget within 12 years could be interest on the federal debt. And what do you get for interest on the federal debt? I will use a very sophisticated Southern term. I'm from Alabama. It's called shinola. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay? Now, if that's not enough, let's talk about it from another angle. In 1969, when Congress came to town, they got to decide how 64%, or almost two-thirds of the federal budget, would be spent. Last year, 34%. In other words, because of existing laws, agricultural subsidies, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, civilian military pensions, retiree health care, all these issues, they really only have control over 34% of the budget, and it's getting squeezed on autopilot because much of the budget that's automatic is growing faster than inflation and faster than the economy, especially health care costs, and I'll come back to that. Well, this is a real problem because guess what? Those of you who may study the Constitution, as I do, will find out that every express and enumerated responsibility envisioned by the founders for the federal government is included in that 34%. Every single one. For example, national defense, foreign policy, federal judicial system, executive office of the president, treasury functions, Congress of the United States, just to name a few. They're all in the 34% that's getting squeezed. The past cannot be prologue. Our problem today are not today's deficits and debt, although they're bad. Deficit for 2009, $1.42 trillion. Almost $4 billion a day. Bless you. Deficit last year, meaning 08, $459 billion. Deficit the year before, $161 billion. So the deficit is 9 times higher in 2009 than 2007. Now, part of that's because of the recession. Part of that's because of unprecedented actions by the government dealing with financial institutions, housing, etc. Some of that is understandable, all right? The debt, $12 trillion plus today. But the real problem is not today's deficits and debt, it's where we're headed, and it's the off-balance sheet obligations, the unfunded obligations for Medicare and for Social Security. As of the end of 2008, because the 2009 numbers have not been released yet officially, the United States was at a $56 trillion hole. That was the sum of the total liabilities and unfunded promises for Medicare and Social Security. That was up from $20 trillion when George Bush took office. The number for 2009 will be known about December 15th, and it will be well over $60 trillion. So that means that since President Clinton left office, the total liabilities and unfunded promises have more than tripled. And the federal debt has more than doubled. And unfortunately, on the path that we're on, the federal debt could more than double again under the current president if tough choices aren't made sooner rather than later. And you're dealing with much bigger numbers now than you were back then. Now let's translate $56 trillion, which is last year's number, to numbers that you and I and others might be able to relate to more. $184,000 per person, including newborn babies. So you might ask, now you know why newborn babies cry. Because they come into the world with a burden of $184,000. And on a household basis, last year's number was $483,000 per household. Believe it or not, median household income in America is about $50,000. Median household income in America is about $50,000. We have growing gaps between the haves and the have-nots, all right? That means that under our status quo, do nothing, let it ride path, The typical American household has a second or third mortgage, which they don't know about, that is equal to about 9 to 10 times their annual household income. But there's no house to back this mortgage. Only your citizenship and your earning power for the future. This is the real graphic. This is total federal debt as a percentage of the economy, the relative burden of how much debt we have. From 1800 to 2050, based upon our current path. Let me explain this a little bit. At the beginning of the Republic in 1789, which is before this, but I happen to know the numbers, this country had debt equal to 40% of the economy. But we got something for that debt. We won our independence, and as part of the deal to get ratification of the Constitution, not only was there an agreement to put the capital in what now is Washington, D.C., there was an agreement for the federal government to assume all the debt of the colonies, the now states, the 13 states. So the total national debt, federal and state, was 40% of the economy. Today, it's 85% federal alone, headed to 95% next year, headed to 300% plus on our status quo do-nothing path within the next several decades. That's third world level. The fact is that from 1789 until about the 1980s, and this is not a political statement, it's a factual statement, America did not run large deficits and accumulate debt unless we were at war, in a depression, or faced a serious recession. But starting in the 1980s, both America and Americans, too many Americans, became addicted to conspicuous consumption and debt. Let's have it now, we'll pay for it later. And it became acceptable, rather than to have a balanced budget, to say, well, all we really need to do is to have a deficit of about 3% of the economy, and if we grow the economy by 3%, then the relative level of burden doesn't change, we're okay. Problem is, if you have a deficit of 3% of the economy in peacetime, when the economy's growing, what kind of deficit are you going to have in wartime when you're in a recession? Like last year, 10%. Those numbers don't work, or as they say in Texas, that dog don't hunt. You know, we have totally lost sight of the fact that we need to have prudent fiscal policies. And so what happened is in World War II, we had debt, at the end of World War II, we had debt to GDP of 122%, all-time high. But we got something for it. We defeated the Axis powers. We saved the free world. We avoided attack on our homeland. And after World War II, the United States was over 50% of the global economy, and the dollar was as good as gold. But because of our stewardship responsibility to leave things better off for future generations, efforts were taken to grow the economy, to minimize deficits, and the burden, you can see, decreased dramatically until the 80s. And then it went up, and until George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, who I was a presidential opponent of, did three things, which, by the way, President Clinton did too. They have this in common. He broke a campaign promise, increased taxes. He imposed tough spending controls, statutory budget controls, and he did not increase entitlement benefits. And guess what? President William Jefferson Clinton did the same thing. He broke a campaign promise on taxes by not giving a middle-class tax cut because we couldn't afford it. He stayed with tough statutory budget controls that constrained spending. He did not expand entitlements. In fact, he passed welfare reform, or championed welfare reform. So those two presidents, Bush 41 and William Jefferson Clinton, especially William Jefferson Clinton, deserve tremendous credit for doing what was right for America, even though they paid a political price. In the case of Bush 41, he didn't get reelected in large part because of that, which enabled President Clinton to come in. In the case of President Clinton, he lost the House. in part because of that, in part because of health care reform. We're back on that again. I'll come back to it. So they deserve credit. Well, then what happened when President Clinton left office? Well, we had a real surplus. We were paying down debt, really paying it down. There's only 1 year we paid it down, year 2000. Only 1 year. Because all the other years, we didn't really have a surplus because we were spending all the Social Security surplus. So the only year that we really had a real surplus was 2000, because we not only had a surplus on a unified basis, we had a surplus on an operating basis, so we actually started paying down debt. Well, but that changed when George W. Bush came in, who was arguably the most fiscally irresponsible president in the history of the Republic. And part of that was because the budget controls expired in 2002. And when the budget controls expired in 2002, Congress was out of control. It was tax cuts, spending increases, entitlement expansions, undeclared wars. Keep in mind, Congress hadn't declared war since World War II. I thought the Constitution said something about that. You know, it's one thing, the most outrageous one was Iraq, in my view. My son fought in Iraq as a Marine Corps officer, and he's fine. He went on an offense the first night and is fine. But the simple fact of the matter is we invaded a sovereign nation. You should never do that if you don't declare war. And the result of that is that we now basically have to spend a bunch of money because troops are in the field. Here's what the future looks like under our current path. The bar is spending as a percentage of the economy. The line is revenues as a percentage of the economy based on historical trends. If the bar is above the line, it's a deficit. The fastest growing component is interest on the debt, which is the blue. And again, we get nothing for it. That's an unacceptable scenario. Here's another story. At the end of World War II, when we had debt equal to 122% of GDP, we had no foreign debt. We owed it all to Americans. And therefore, all the interest payments stayed in our economy and benefited our economy. In 1990, 19% of the debt held by the public was held by foreign lenders. At the beginning of 2009, it was 49%. Now it's over 50% and climbing. America is being mortgaged, and increasingly that mortgage is not held by Americans. That is not in our economic, foreign policy, national security, or even domestic tranquility interests over time. You must pay attention to your bankers. And when your bankers are foreign nations, you must pay attention. They have already flexed their muscles. Japan and China, China our largest lender, Japan second, already flexed their muscles as a result of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The United States taxpayers did not stand behind the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt. It was not guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. However, earlier this year, when Japan and China demanded that they be protected because they owned a lot of that debt, we, the taxpayers, now have guaranteed $5 trillion plus of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt because our foreign lenders have already flexed their muscles. And right now they're willing to lend us a lot of money at low interest rates, but if they lose patience, if they believe that we're not going to put our own financial house in order, I can assure you interest rates could go up dramatically, the dollar could fall dramatically, and that would not be not only in our interest, your interest, or frankly the world's interest. There are 4 common denominators between the mortgage-related subprime crisis and the deteriorating financial condition of the United States government. In the mortgage-related subprime, the people who originated the mortgages and made all the origination fees aren't the one who held the loans and took the losses when the bubble burst. For the federal government, today's taxpayers benefit from low-tax, high-spend policies. Tomorrow's taxpayers will pay the price and bear the burden. There's only 2 kinds of taxes: current taxes and deferred taxes. And deficits and debt represents deferred taxes with interest. Secondly, There was inadequate transparency about the nature and extent and magnitude of the related risk with regard to these securitized mortgage arrangements, collateralized mortgage obligations, credit default insurance, which really wasn't insurance. People didn't really understand the situation, and as a result, when the bubble burst, there were a lot of big and bad surprises. Same thing for the federal government. The problem is not today's deficit and debt, it's where we're headed. The problem is not what's on the balance sheet, it's what's off the balance sheet. That's the problem, and it's not getting enough attention. Too much debt or leverage, not enough focus on cash flow, and over-reliance on credit ratings. Just ask Bear Stearns. They were worth a lot of money on the books, but they couldn't meet their obligations when due. They didn't have the cash flow. Think about these collateralized mortgage obligations. They were rated by Standard & Poor's and Moody's as being AAA one day and junk bond status the next day. Well, what about the federal government? Well, we're already negative cash flow on Medicare Part A. We're already negative cash flow on disability income. We just turned negative cash flow for Social Security. FDIC has had to ask for 3 years' worth of premium payments for banks in a row. We're negative cash flow on the hospital, on the highway trust fund, and we're going to be negative cash flow on the airport trust fund within 3 years. Cash is key. Cash is a leading indicator to serious financial problems, negative cash flow. And what about our credit ratings? Right now, the United States is rated AAA, but we benefit from home team bias. The rating agencies are based here. They recently downgraded the outlook for the United Kingdom, and our ratios are worse than the United Kingdom in many regards. We benefit from the fact that we have 64% of the world's reserve currency, which means that we have more rope, but not unlimited rope. And last, a failure of normal oversight, regulatory, and risk management functions in both the public sector and the private sector act until there was a crisis. And then when they acted, it was out of crisis management. It cost us a lot of money, some of which was appropriate, a lot of which was wasted. And guess what? That's what Congress is doing now. Nothing. Nothing. They're doing nothing to try to address what is a ticking time bomb with regard to this nation's finances. And in fact, they're probably going to make it worse, depending upon what ends up happening with health care. There is a way forward. It is not hopeless. Yes, we can reimpose tough statutory budget controls like the ones that we had during Bush 41 and President Clinton. Once we turn the corner on the economy, once we get past the immediate crises, to provide the discipline necessary that has been missing since 2002. Yes, we can reform Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, more savings-oriented, to where people who are retired or close to retirement won't be affected, but where we'll encourage people to work longer, provide stronger benefits for people near poverty, not quite as strong for middle and upper income, but keep that program here indefinitely. Yes, we do need universal health care, but at a level that is appropriate, affordable, and sustainable. We have to focus on reducing costs first, because if there's one thing that could bankrupt America, it's out-of-control health care costs. That could literally bankrupt America, and that's where we're headed right now. By the way, you cannot reduce health care costs by expanding coverage. That's called an oxymoron. We need to reform our tax system to make it more streamlined, more simplified, more understandable, more administratable, more equitable. And guess what? We got to generate enough money to pay our bills and deliver on the promises that we intend to keep. We're short now, we're going to get a lot shorter in the future. And by the way, if we don't make these tough choices sooner rather than later, taxes are going to go up more. Taxes will double by 2040 at the federal level alone if we don't make these tough choices. Why? Because a very disturbing four-letter word: math. Math, okay? The longer you wait, the bigger changes you have to make. But the longer you wait, the more you risk passing a tipping point where foreign lenders lose patience in us and we could lose control of our own destiny. That must not happen. The simple fact is that we have to also look at major spending policies and tax preferences and figure out which ones ought to stay and which ones ought to go, because a lot of them are outdated or ineffective, and they're based on the past rather than the future. But to make these things happen, you're not going to be able to rely on Congress to do it the old-fashioned way, because they are dysfunctional. They can't even get the easy stuff done. By the way, Social Security in basketball terms is a layup. Not a slam dunk, it's a layup. Healthcare reform is a three-point play from underneath the opponent's basket. We're going to have to dribble a little bit, take a few shots before we're going to really score and have a sustainable success. We're going to need some type of a fiscal future commission that will engage the American people with the truth, talk about the tough choices, what the options are, the prudence of acting sooner rather than later, the consequences that if we don't, to help people understand there is a way to do this that is intergenerationally fair and that will keep our country from going across a fiscal cliff. Remember the advertising Harry and Louise? How many of you have seen the movie Thelma and Louise? We are headed for Thelma and Louise on a fiscal abyss. We must put on the brakes and turn the steering wheel. And that is the simple truth. So we need to do that. We need to do it in 2010. Once we turn the corner on the economy, once we get past the immediate crisis. Healthcare. Healthcare reform should meet 4 key tests of fiscal responsibility. Number 1, it should pay for itself over 10 years. The President's credit, he said he wants that. Secondly, shouldn't add to deficits beyond 10 years. To the President's credit, he says he doesn't want to add deficits in the future. In my opinion, the future includes past 10 years. But in Washington, it doesn't. In Washington, they think things in 10 years. It's the flat earth budget theory. Okay? Number 3, it should result in a significant reduction or down payment, non-debt finance down payment, in the current unfunded Medicare promises. $38 trillion. Medicare's underwater, $38 trillion. The prescription drug benefit, underwater, $7.2 trillion. About as much as Social Security. And we must bend down, not up, total health care costs as a percentage of the economy after reforms. They're talking about bending the curve. They forgot one word, down. You got to bend it down, not up, because the current reforms bend it up. In large part because of what I said before. You cannot reduce health care costs by expanding coverage. You have to make tough choices on payment systems, on tax policies, on taxpayer subsidies. You have to make those tough choices. And the can is being kicked down the road once again. This is not just about numbers. I can give you plenty of big and bad numbers. Keep in mind, a trillion has 12 zeros to the right of it without the pennies. It's about stewardship. Stewardship means that leaders have a responsibility not just to generate positive results today, not just to leave things better off when you leave than when you came, but leave things better positioned for the future. The baby boom generation, my generation, is on track to be the first in the history of this republic to fail. We're on a path today where our children and grandchildren will not have as much opportunity or as good a quality of life. For the first time in American history, average education level, average income, average health status is going down, not up, for the first time in American history. That is unacceptable. At a time where we face increasing competition in a globalized world. And it's not just about stewardship, it's about people. These are my 3 grandchildren. I got married at 19. I've been married to the same woman for 38 years. We have 2 children, 3 grandchildren. I'm worried about my kids somewhat. I'm not worried about me. I'm very worried about my grandchildren. They did not create this problem, but it is their problem. They will pay the price. They will bear the burden. They will suffer the consequences if elected officials don't start making tough choices. President George H.W. Bush did. President William Jefferson Clinton definitely did. It's time that President Barack Obama do. He must start looking to the future in 2010. He must endorse the need for a Fiscal Future Commission. He must help people understand the need to make tough choices today so that we can have a better tomorrow. Because I know the Chinese premier, I know heads of OPEC, and their public admonitions of our fiscal irresponsibility have merit. And they are not stupid people. We need to get the message and start putting our own financial house in order before it's too late. In summary, we face serious challenges that threaten our future, but we can solve these problems with some leadership if we get started soon and if the first 3 words in the Constitution come alive, and who knows what they are. We the people. We the people are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen in this country. We are on an imprudent and unsustainable path. Tough choices are necessary. We need policy reforms, operational reforms, and political reforms. And we need constitutional amendments. Constitutional amendments dealing with issues like how we redistrict, campaign finance, term limits, and to try to help elect half the House every 2 years rather than the entire House so that they have 4-year terms and they actually have time to do something. And we need to move away from career politicians. You can be a career politician if you want to, just not in the same job. Because that stifles creativity and innovation and it undercuts courage. But ultimately, this country only has one chief executive officer who also has to be the commander-in-chief, and only one person who commands the bully pulpit, and that is the President of the United States. And so Barack Obama has to lead in 2010. And Democrats and Republicans in sufficient numbers must follow. But for that to happen, the first 3 words in the Constitution have to come alive. So it's up to you, it's up to me. Together we can do it. Let's do it. Thank you.
Welcome to Arkansas.
Thank you.
As you may know, Arkansas is at the bottom of many lists, but one thing we have is zero-based budgeting, and we are not in debt. Is it possible that instituting zero-based budgeting for the United States at this point might be a good idea, or would there be such unintended consequences in the institutional investing community that it's not possible?
Well, one of the things I advocate in the book is what I call rebaselining, which is, maybe a version of zero-based budgeting. If you look at our federal tax policies, we lose $1 trillion a year in revenues because of tax preferences, deductions, exemptions, exclusions, credits, some of which work, some of which don't, some of which benefit the well-off disproportionately than the non-well-off. And so that's one aspect. The other side of the ledger is we spend several $1 trillion a year in federal government spending programs, many of which are based on, to be kind, the 20th century rather than the 21st century, a lot of which don't work. They don't generate positive results, and they may not be as high a priority. So I think what we need to do, and what I advocate in the book is I lay out about a dozen basic questions that we need to have an extraordinary process, something like a Hoover II Commission, that's back from the Truman era, and to where we end up re-looking at government, asking a tough list of questions so that this group can make recommendations to the Congress to basically eliminate things that don't work, consolidate a bunch of things, so that we can free up fiscal flexibility, actually invest more in some things that are important to help create a better future, like basic research, critical infrastructure, prevention and wellness, and things of that nature, if you will. So it's not zero-based budgeting, but it is a concept that is intellectually similar to that. The other thing that we need to do is We actually need key national outcome-based indicators: economic, safety, security, social, environmental, so we can understand how we're doing, whether we're getting better or worse, and how we compare to other national governments, because we're below average in a lot of things. For example, we spend twice per person any industrialized nation, more than any industrialized nation, on K through 12 education and health care. And we're not even top 20 in either one. So it's not a matter of money. The system's broken. The system needs to be fixed. Last thing is, we need a credit card limit. You know, we need a constitutional amendment on how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on. We need a line item veto, all right, among other things. You know, we have a credit card limit today. It's just not constitutional. The problem is the Chinese haven't told us what it is yet. I don't like that, and you shouldn't either.
Question. Sir, you back there?
Mr. Walker, my question has to do with accountability. We currently do not know exactly who they are or where they are, but there are a large number of zombie banks that are still open for business. It's my understanding the FDIC does not have enough money to close these banks. Therefore, they remain open, digging a bigger hole to be filled sometime in the future. Who holds the FDIC accountable? Secondly, the Federal Reserve System is making serious economic decisions on behalf of everyone in the country, and most of us do not realize that it's a private corporation, not a government entity. How do we hold the Federal Reserve accountable, and how do we hold the FDIC accountable?
Well, first, in the case of the FDIC, they have had significant diminution of their reserves. They have institutions they need to deal with that they need additional resources to be able to deal with, and that's why they're asking for 3 years advance payment on premiums so that they can end up having some reserves to be able to deal with some of the issues that you touch on. The simple fact is the Congress is supposed to hold them accountable, all right? Frankly, if Congress got paid for performance, they'd owe money, all right? And so the Congress, now the Fed, let's talk about the Fed. I divide the Fed into several components. Monetary policy, where I think they need flexibility, and where I think they should not be subject to political intervention or undue questioning by even GAO. All right? I think Ron Paul's bill is wrong on that. I think it's counterproductive. On the other hand, with regard to bailouts and with regard to regulation of financial institutions, they need a lot more transparency and they need a lot more accountability than they get right now. And so I think that we need to break it down between what do they do and in what areas do they need more transparency and accountability, maybe even more restrictions, and in what area would it be tremendously counterproductive for us to change, and that's monetary policy. Last thing you want to see is politicians dealing with monetary policy. They've obviously blown fiscal policy big time. You want them to decide monetary policy?
Ma'am, we're right there. 1 second, wait for the mic. He's coming. Thanks.
Hello. You mentioned that we are at risk of passing a tipping point of excess foreign debt. What examples would there be of what happens if we pass that excess of foreign debt?
I think the biggest risk that we face is that foreign lenders will be concerned that we're not going to put our own financial house in order. We're not going to deal with not our short-term deficits, that's not the problem, our structural imbalances. They're not going to dump our debt, they can't. They can try to sell it to somebody else, but they can't dump it. They can't say, pay me back early. They can't do that, all right? What they can do is not buy as much and demand a lot higher interest rates for what they do buy. That's what they can do.
There's no risk of nationalization?
Well, they can't nationalize us. You may default? Is that what you're talking about? Okay. Default? First, I don't think we'll ever default. I don't think we'll ever do that. Here's the key. Some people say, well, let's just inflate our way out of it. You can't. And the reason you can't inflate your way out of it is inflation will reduce the burden of the $12 trillion in debt. But that's not what threatens the ship of state. What threatens the ship of state is the 40 trillion plus in unfunded obligations for Medicare and Social Security. They grow faster than inflation, and they grow faster than the economy when the economy is growing. And so because of that simple four-letter word, math, we have to make tough choices. And those tough choices are as follows. We have to reimpose tough statutory budget controls. We need to encourage people to work longer in Social Security, have somewhat more revenues for those that are better off, somewhat less replacement benefits for those, but they still get it. We need to focus on more realistic levels of universal health care coverage. We need to change payment systems to control health care costs. We need to have a budget for health care. We're the only major industrialized nation that does not have a budget for health care. Stay tuned to 60 Minutes. Sunday night, I'm one of several people going to be on that talking about health care. That's the thing that will bankrupt the country. We've got to focus on cost first, or else we're going to be in trouble. You know, we need to reform our tax system. We're probably going to have a value-added tax earmarked for health care. We need to get rid of a lot of these tax preferences that don't work and that benefit the well-off disproportionately. Let me give you an example on health care. We lose $300 billion a year in the fact that people don't pay income tax or payroll tax on employer-provided and paid health care. Now let me tell you the effect of that is. If you're a CEO for a private sector company in the top marginal tax rate, the taxpayers subsidize your health care big time. If you're in small business, making a little bit above the minimum wage, and you don't have any health care because your employer can't afford it, you get, here's that word again, shinola. No subsidy. So we're subsidizing the well-off, and we're doing nothing for people who are near poor. That's current government policy. I'll give you another example. Medicare, Part B and D. The premium you pay for Part B and D pays for, on average, 25% of the cost, no matter how well off you are. Who pays the other 75%? Our kids and grandkids with interest. It's one thing to have a 75% subsidy for somebody who's near poor. It's another thing to have a 75% subsidy for somebody who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in retirement. We do that now. We have to differentiate between universal opportunity and public subsidy. We don't do that now. We want to treat everybody the same, so therefore we create a system that is irresponsible, unaffordable, unsustainable.
Question. Any?
One of the things that I always carry with me along with the New Testament is this, whatever you see, because I truly believe with that, we the people. I would like to ask you one of the basic things I've always done before we had the classroom of the Clinton School of Public Service. That was to demystify math as it relates to public policy. And one of the things that I taught parents and public citizens in the Chapter 1 program was that they needed to have a vocabulary, a fiscal math vocabulary. And that was they had to all learn the structural order of from 100 to the trillion. Mm-hmm. They had to know that vocabulary. The next thing, they had to know the number of zeros each one of them had. Right. The next thing they needed to know is when you look at anybody's budget, whether it's the school board budget, the state budget, the federal budget, or even the UN budget, it's always in base 10. So all you need to look and see what is the value system that's represented. And then you look and see whether it's between 1 and 9 and how many zeros that line item has. And you'll know where it fits. Was that a good demystifying lesson to teach people?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think one of the challenges that we face right now is just like in the 1930s, when America had to go from millions to billions, today America has to go from billions to trillions. It's very, very important that we make that transition quickly, because otherwise some politicians would lead you to believe that a few $100 billion isn't very much money. And it's a lot of money. Okay, so yes. Now, we're not top 25 in the world in math and science at high school level. We need to do a lot better job on financial literacy and civic responsibility as well. In fact, I believe that because we don't do a good job on personal financial responsibility and civic responsibility, that contributes to a climate where politicians can do irresponsible things and people don't understand what they can and should do as a citizen under their responsibilities as we the people to hold them responsible and accountable for not just what they do. The biggest problem we have right now is what they fail to do. Because there's two things as a fiduciary breach: what you do that's inappropriate and what you fail to do that you should do. And that's where we have the biggest problem.
Question. You've been raising your hand, sir. Yes.
I'm also an accountant, so I'll ask you an accounting question.
Okay.
I've never seen a good comparison of last year's deficit and to the most recent one that kind of helps me understand just the components of the change. And I was interested particularly in the impact of the stimulus being affecting multiple years, and also the fact that I think all the fiscal financial bailout money wasn't used and some's been repaid. How does that affect the numbers?
Okay, well, first, in fairness to President Obama, I think that the CBO's projection for what the deficit was going to be, Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan agency in the legislative branch, okay, they projected that the budget deficit the week before President Obama was sworn into office for fiscal 2009 was going to be $1.2 trillion. So I think that's his baseline, okay? The actual budget deficit was 1.42. The primary reason for the difference is the recession was somewhat worse, and plus he had a stimulus program. But there was a problem with the stimulus program. A stimulus is theoretically timely, targeted, and temporary. Of the $787 billion stimulus program, according to that same Congressional Budget Office, only about a third of it met that definition. A lot of the things in the stimulus program haven't been spent yet, and they couldn't be spent quickly, so they're not really stimulus. I mean, stimulus, you're trying to get something out as quickly as you can. They represented wants in spending that people wanted for a long time, but they didn't want to have to pay for it. So they put it in an emergency bill and did that. Same thing on the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which is more President Bush 43's responsibility, although there have been some problems carried over. You know, when you spent that money, when you're going to push out several $100 billion out the door, I would argue you need to have three things. You need to have clearly defined objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? Number two, you need to have clearly defined and transparent criteria about who should be eligible to get the money and who shouldn't. And number three, you ought to have conditions established up front as to what those institutions can and can't do with the money. Guess what? We were 0 for 3. That's called a strikeout. So as a result, a lot of people got the money that didn't need it. A lot of people that got the money that, you know, did things with it that were inappropriate, including paying outrageous bonuses, all right? And that's why, in part, we are where we are. So the answer is for President Obama, $1.2 trillion, I think, is the appropriate benchmark. He came in at 1.42. But on the other hand, when you look in the out years, the numbers are worse. I mean, the gap is greater. And one of the debates that we're having right now is, should we grow government or not? And if we grow government, do we pay for it? Those are two great debates. Just keep in mind, we've already made tens of trillions of dollars in promises that we don't know how we're going to pay for yet. So we need to do more than just pay for the addition. I'll give you an analogy for healthcare. I don't think I've said this. Let's assume that our healthcare system is a house. It's built on a sinkhole of sand. The foundation is cracked. The plumbing leaks. The roof needs repair, and it's mortgaged for more than it's worth. So that means that it's headed for condemnation and foreclosure. You can't just add a new wing made out of the same materials to that structure, okay? And even if you pay for it for the first 10 years, wink, wink, all right, it's attached to a structure that is headed for condemnation and is mortgaged for more than it's worth. You can't call that progress. All right? Yeah, I believe in universal coverage for basic and essential preventative wellness and catastrophe. I believe in that. And I believe that people ought to have an opportunity to be able to get more through choice and competition if they want it. But we got to be more honest with the American people about what we can afford and sustain. And that's where there's failure across the board. I mean, it's not a Democrat, Republican, it's not a personal thing. It's been this way for a while. It's part of the dysfunctional democracy.
You have been watching the Clinton School Speaker Series, a public service program produced by UALR University Television in cooperation with the Clinton School of Public Service.
The largest threat facing the United States is not terrorism. It is not nuclear proliferation. It is not climate change, although those are all important. It is our own fiscal irresponsibility. We are pushing this country towards bankruptcy at an alarming rate. I think the biggest risk that we face is that foreign lenders will be concerned that we're not going to put our own financial house in order. We're not going to deal with not our short-term deficits, that's not the problem, our structural imbalances. They're not going to dump our debt, they can't. They can try to sell it to somebody else, but they can't dump it. They can't say, pay me back early. They can't do that, all right? What they can do is not buy as much and demand a lot higher interest rates for what they do buy.